hello, and welcome to another episode of Legacy Insights. I'm your host for today, Tanya Major, and we have a very special episode titled The Significance of a Legacy. Today's conversation is one you won't want to miss as we sit down with BFMI's senior pastors, Dr. Dave and Angela Burrows. They'll be sharing their perspectives on the significance of carrying forward the powerful legacy left by our founders and how it continues to influence the direction of the ministry today. Guiding this conversation is none other than our Legacy Committee Chairman, Dr. Kendall Major. Now let's join Dr. Kendall Major and our senior pastors for this important discussion on legacy.
Good evening. Welcome everyone to this special episode of Legacy Insights. My name is Dr. Kendall Major, and I will serve as your host this evening. Before we introduce our distinguished guests, just a few words about our theme for the entire month of November: the legacy of kingdom influence. We remember, we honor, we continue. Legacy is an entity that transcends time, a bridge between the past, the present, and the future. It is not just about what we leave behind, but about how we live our lives in a way that impacts generations. After the passing of great leadership, the mantle often falls on those prepared to continue the vision forward, ensuring that the legacy does not fade, but in fact flourishes. November 9th, 2014, it will forever be imprinted in the hearts of each of us, this ministry, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and indeed the global village. We received that devastating news on that fateful day. 9 beloved souls: Dr. Miles Monroe, Ruth Ann Monroe, Dr. Richard Pinder, Pastor Lavard and Riddell Parks, along with their young son, Master Johannan, First Officer Frakan Cooper, and Captain Stanley Thurston, and faithful follower Diego D. Santiago. They were tragically taken from us in an instant. The suddenness of their passing sent shockwaves throughout the world. Many of us still remember the weight of that moment with the inevitable question: where were you when you heard the news? Through the loss, although it shocked us to our core, it became a defining moment for our Bahamas Faith Ministry International family and many of our affiliates. In the face of overwhelming grief, we chose to survive, but to thrive, embracing and advancing the transformative message Dr. Monroe so passionately lived and preached, turning followers into leaders and leaders into agents of change. As we approach November 9th, 2024, the 10-year mark since their passing, we reflect on their internal mission and a testament to their unwavering dedication of spreading the gospel of the kingdom of God. Their legacy inspires us and challenges us to fulfill the vision they so faithfully championed. In their honor, our senior pastor, Dr. David Burrows, established the Legacy Committee, ensuring that the profound work they began will continue to inspire and shape future generations. This committee represents our collective commitment of preserving their legacy while propelling forward the vision that started humbly in 1980 and has since grown into a global movement. Today, and over the last 10 years, we have flourished under the leadership of Dr. Dave and Angela Burrows. Our focus tonight is the significance of legacy. While continuing the legacy of a great leader is a monumental task, it's important to note that our guests today are not only stewards of the vision and the legacy, but also they are accomplished in their own individual lives and their own right. Their unique journey in leadership and their vision have impacted many and contributed greatly to their success and the success of this ministry and beyond. I speak none other than two pillars of Bahamas Faith Ministry International, our distinguished senior pastor, Dr. David Burrows, and Dr. Angela Burrows. Welcome to Legacy Insights. We will be right back after these messages. Welcome back. Pastor Dave and Pastor Angie, what a delight it is to have you on the set this evening. Now, you've been in youth ministry for many years, and tell us some of the key moments in the early days, back in the 80s, I believe it was, when you started youth ministry. Tell us a little bit about that experience, what people would say back in the day.
Well, the interesting thing about it is that when Bahamas Faith Ministry started, everybody was a youth. We were all young.
Everybody was young, huh?
So we didn't really start out with a separate youth ministry. It was basically a youth ministry. But over time, in 1984, when we moved from Balmoral to Mackey Street, is when the youth ministry launched. And we launched the youth ministry because we started to have a growing young presence in addition to us being young, and we decided that we needed to have something targeted at young people. So I was selected because I was already doing youth ministry. I began in youth ministry unofficially just by trying to reach my friends. And Dr. Monroe recognized that, and he asked me, and he said, would you spearhead the youth ministry? Pastor Angie was actually in school at the time.
I see.
In the initial phases. And so we began on Mackey Street.
And you didn't have any real example before then, because y'all started organically, and so this was a new frontier. So tell us a little bit about the challenges in dealing with youth, being a young person yourself, and in leading youth.
You know, what was interesting about BFM is that we were pioneers. There was no template.
Exactly.
You had initially 3 young men who graduated from college who had seen a vision of what ministry could be, which was totally different than anything that was happening in the Bahamas. So we had this vision, but there was no roadmap.
Exactly.
And so everything was kind of an experiment. But the passion and the desire just drove us to be creative, and then we were guided by the Spirit to just do things. So the youth ministry followed that same pattern. You know, I had no experience in ministry. I didn't know what ministry was about, but I knew that I wanted to reach my friends. And so I initially, people tried to get me into the traditional church type thing.
I see.
But I couldn't relate to it at all. And I realized that if I was going to reach persons like myself on the street, it had to be a different approach. And so I began to use approaches that were unheard of. But I was just flowing from my spiritual insight, my passion, my creativity, and it just blossomed.
That's interesting. And somehow, Pastor Angie, at that moment, y'all were tied. Y'all were not married in the early days, but you also joined the youth movement, so to speak. How was that experience for you?
It was a beautiful experience for me. It wasn't, I know you used the word challenge. I really can say, honestly, I didn't have any challenges.
Wow.
I was so happy to serve. And I recall standing in my parents' home next to, back in the day, you had what we would call a record player. You had 45s and you also had long play albums. And there was a song I used to stand by the stereo set and sing. And the song was, I am a servant. I've been listening for my name
I
and
see.
some other words. And so I was in a place with God where I just wanted to serve. And so I was happy to serve. And so it was never a problem. And my passion was to help young people. So I never saw anything, even some situations that may not have been as pleasant as they could have been, I never could actually even call it a challenge. I was so happy to be able to serve.
That's amazing because you two ended up being in ministry for almost 30 years serving young people. What would you want your legacy to be over the years as far as the youth ministry is concerned? Pastor Dave?
Well, I think in terms of legacy, that we created a paradigm shift.
Well, I want to ask you this question. You've been in youth ministry for well over 30 years, or certainly close to 30 years. What would you want your legacy to be?
Well, I think the most important thing that I can think of is that we created a paradigm shift. When we entered youth ministry in Nassau was dull, it was dreary, there wasn't a lot of excitement, and we changed the paradigm. What ended up happening is we had young people from all walks of life who flocked to church because there was something different.
Wow.
And, you know, the message never changed, but the methodology and the creativity and relating to young people and getting young people involved, I think that was a major part of our legacy, a paradigm shift where youth ministry became something that was attractive and people felt comfortable serving God. You know, I'll give you one example of it. I remember we were having a party and church didn't go together.
Didn't go together, absolutely.
And it was what we call an All Saints Bash. So it was a Halloween party, but we didn't believe in Halloween, so we created an alternative. And there was a young man who was standing on the side, and he was witnessing what was going on. So we were having fun. You know, people were dancing, doing backflips, nothing vulgar, nothing out of the way, and all of the music was positive and uplifting. And he looked at me and he said, "Man, you know, if I know you could have this much fun as a Christian, I would have been a Christian a long time ago." You know, and I think that is the legacy of the youth ministry of Bahamas Faith Ministries. We created a paradigm shift where people felt comfortable and happy serving God.
And Bahamas Faith Ministries stood out as one of, or the only ministry that actually practiced this mode of youth ministry.
In the early days,
Yeah,
and it created a lot of attack. So basically, you know, I could remember on Sunday mornings when you turn on the television, persons were preaching about me. You know, they were preaching about this roughneck pastor. He came and changed the church, and now you have all of this. One pastor, he called it boogie-aga music in the church. And, you know, so it was a lot of attack. But what ended up happening was that the young people from those churches started coming to us.
Exactly.
And then eventually, what was interesting is eventually some of those same churches that attacked us and criticized us, they ended up calling us for help. How can we reach young people? So I think that's a great element of the legacy.
Excellent. And what would you say are some of the lessons learned over the many years of training, teaching, and advocating for young people? And what advice you would give young people today?
I think one of the most important lessons is that you have to give your gift to God and let Him direct you. You know, sometimes you can have an existing template, and if you come into ministry, you can say, well, okay, let me just follow the existing template. But just like how David he needed a different wardrobe. That's how I felt about my situation. You know, I couldn't fight with the clothes that people wanted to put on me.
Exactly.
I needed a different wardrobe. And so I used what was inside of me through the direction of the Holy Spirit to accomplish the purpose of God. It didn't look normal and it wasn't designed to be normal. We needed a shock in the Bahamas because youth ministry was dead, and the gospel was not attractive, which is not something that God wanted. And so I thank God that he used me to change the paradigm.
Has it, Dr. Passagie? You were going to say something?
I would say that I appreciate everything Pastor Dave said, and I agree. And the legacy is that you were there, laboring in prayer sometimes, laboring in love, laboring in the difficult moments with people. Sometimes there were happy times, and there were people who had a lot of struggles. And I know even when we would have events, let me just veer off into that, there were people, we lived in Stapleton Gardens, and there were people who lived in San Souci, in Carmichael Road, Elizabeth Estates, who would call for a ride because they didn't want to miss it. And those opportunities, that being one-on-one with those people, allowed me a space into their lives. So even though many of them are adults, well, all of them are adults, very successful, many of them, they still call me if they have important decisions to make. And some of these people are really successful people. And I realized they knew I genuinely cared, and people really want to know that you care. And so I feel that my legacy will be one of love, loving people, caring for people,
Excellent.
and praying for people.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, over the years, with the paradigm shift of and the cultural norms that we've seen, in ministering to young people, has it changed over the years, or would you say the same message exists even now from the time that you all started youth ministry to now, despite all of the changes in in cultures?
Well, the thing about the gospel is that the gospel cannot change. There's only one gospel. Jesus said he came to bring good news, the message of the kingdom. So that's the only gospel. The only question is, how do we present it?
Exactly.
And how do we get people to access this great beneficial gospel that will change their lives? And thankfully, we were able to do that. Pastor Angie mentioned something that I think a lot of people don't realize about the youth ministry of BFM. It was fun, it accomplished a lot of things, but it was a lot of work.
Absolutely.
She mentioned that we would leave from Tropical Gardens, drive to San Souci to pick up young people every Friday night. We would drive all over this island, her
That's
and I.
from west to east. That's
And
the
pick
whole
up-
island.
Pick up young people and bring them to Mackey Street. And those young people appreciated that. Not only that, we used to have the young people in our homes.
Yes.
So Sunday after church, we would invite them into our home. So we put in work. We got stripes when it comes to, the work of the ministry.
So what I'm hearing is your sensitivity to their plight, and also the love and the connectivity of the young people. Y'all were young. You know what I'm curious about? What age group, when you say young people then and now, what age groups were you talking about? As young as how young, and how and up to what, early
We were
adulthood?
talking about teenagers.
Teenagers, basically teenagers.
Yes, teenagers, yeah.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Thank you very much. Well, we're going to move on to another segment, which is family life and a personal journey. And I find this interesting because in most of your youth ministry responsibilities, you were married.
Yes.
And marriage, it has its own challenges, and you want to have balance because you're raising a family, but yet you want to serve your God through the young people. How has that transition been in balancing family life and young people? Pastor Angie, you want to take that?
You talked about challenges earlier, but it was not a challenge. And of course, with family life, family is priority. Now, when we first started Dr. Major, we didn't have any children.
I see.
And so I was free as a bird to do as I like. So we did everything together in terms of youth ministry, so it was not a challenge. So when I became a mother for the first time, I had to make some changes, but I didn't abandon youth ministry. And the Lord allowed a lady from the church into my life so that she would babysit our son on Wednesdays, because youth group back in the day was Wednesday night,
Gotcha.
not Friday. And so she would babysit our son to give me an opportunity to serve. So even though I had one child and then a second one, it didn't allow me not to serve. Now, of course, if something happened with one of the children, my priority was my children. So family came first, but it didn't prohibit me from serving. And my children loved the youth ministry. And when they were old enough, when I say old enough, they were walking, they would participate with us, and they loved it. So they were in the youth ministry from they were toddlers.
Exactly. Very good.
They were the youth ministry mascots.
They were the mascots.
Yeah, you know. So as Pastor Angie mentioned, from the time that they could walk, you know, Davriel was holding on to my leg, and in youth meetings, so they were a part of it. Now, one of the lessons that we learned is that there's a difference between church and God. Initially, I put church, then family. So church was the priority. But over time, I began to realize that God is the priority. Family is after God, and then church is third. And so that's one of the lessons that we learned along the way. But it was a beautiful time. It was a lot of hard work, but it was enjoyable work. We enjoyed working with young people. We enjoyed seeing lives change. We enjoyed seeing people transform, them develop. And, you know, it's been a beautiful journey.
In fact, that leads me to segue into how did it affect or enhance your relationship as a marriage couple, and what the involvement in ministry and the responsibilities that came in ministry, what did that do, and how did you deal with that?
Now, I think it was a greater problem for me than him, if I may. So at first, we were single. The problem really wasn't the challenge with youth ministry. It was just ministry. I'll explain. So my husband was involved with the church, so they would have board meetings just about weekly that lasted very long, into
very
the
long.
night.
Absolutely.
Then he also was a person who played sports. So he played softball during softball season. He played basketball during basketball season in the church league.
Out of the house.
So my husband was busy because he was involved in so many things. Again, this is before we had children. And I was starting to become frustrated. But I had a fight because I was trying to determine, am I fighting God? And then after a while I said, no. He has to spend some time with me. And so we were able to work it out because it was just too much.
It became too much.
And then the other issue that Pastor Dave alluded to was we had an anniversary, Dr. Kendall. And I assumed we usually would go out for our anniversary, we would do things. I assumed he was going to surprise me. We're going to go out. So it was our anniversary. And so he said, Pastor Miles called an emergency board meeting.
Oh, yeah.
So in my mind, I was like, I cannot believe this. He chose to go to a board meeting versus going out with me. And
That only happened one time.
I was only going to allow that to happen one time. And I couldn't believe it. And I said, so I didn't fuss. I didn't make noise. But when he came home, we had a heart-to-heart.
A discussion.
I said, I understand this, but this isn't going to work for me.
It's going a bit far.
It's not going to work for me because you couldn't save the world tonight. Whatever the problem in the church was, they could solve that without your presence. And so that was a defining moment for me to say, now listen, family comes first.
Yes.
And perhaps if it had not been our anniversary, I may not have been as adamant.
Right.
As
But
adamant about it.
That was an important
But it was
day.
like,
Yeah.
this has to stop.
Yeah.
And so thankfully it never happened again.
Very good. And I appreciate your candor with that, because that's real talk. That's what happens in families, and we have to balance how this happens. Pastor Dave, any response to that?
Yeah, no, it was a wake-up call. You have to remember that I was ignorant. And so there are assumptions made. You know, sometimes you assume that if the church calls you, then God is calling.
Right. You have to
And
kind of
so
separate the
you
two.
have to drop everything.
Yes.
It's almost like being in the mafia.
Yeah.
You know, when you are called, you have to drop everything, and everybody else comes second. But over time, I learned that that's not the proper order. That family is actually first after God. And God and church are two separate things. And so that was a point of growth. It was a lesson.
Yeah.
And that's what happened along the way. We grew through experiences, we grew through knowledge, and it just made things to become better as we went on. It was a growth process.
Yeah. You know, we talked often about, and we're going to segue now into the relationship between the late Pastor Miles, Pastor Ruth, and in particular the late Pastor Richard. And one of the things that we all know and are aware of is that y'all were very close, and particularly to start from Oral Roberts. How then was the relationship? How did y'all meet, and how did the relationship blossom, particularly during your service together?
Well, what's interesting is that Bahamas Faith Ministries, if you break it down to its core, is a tale of three friends. So I was in college, Pastor Miles was in college, Pastor Richard was in college. We were all in ORU. Pastor Miles was like my mentor and big brother. The first time I met him was when we were in college. I met Pastor Richard there also. Pastor Richard and I weren't close, and even Pastor Miles and I weren't close except for the mentorship relationship. We didn't operate in the same social circles. Because, you know, I had just come off the streets, and I wasn't fully immersed into the church thing, so I was a little on the outside. But all of us had this experience at ORU, and so when we returned home, Pastor Miles called Pastor Richard and myself, and we started talking before Bahamas Faith Ministries was ever formed. And we became very close as friends. And so that's how we started. We started out as friends before there was a ministry. And then Pastor Miles introduced us to Pastor Henry. And that group, that small group, was also very close. Well, actually, the whole ministry was close in the early days because it wasn't a large ministry and we did everything together. So it was a tale of friendship. It was a tale of vision, of excitement about the future, about the opportunity to change the world. So we were really driven and we were passionate about changing the culture and changing the approach to the gospel. We actually believed that there was something better than what was being offered at the time. And we began to pursue that. And obviously people got attracted to it because of our enthusiasm, because of the message, and even the methodology. Methodology was different. It was also another paradigm shift for the country. Bahamas Faith Ministries, even in its early stages, began to shift the paradigm for the country when it came to the gospel.
Yes. I see a message there because it's, from what you said, you could see the power of friendship and the power of which is the common vision, and then the corporate vision, which was the ministry. And so y'all were very much in sync, which I think speaks partly to our success today. Pastor Angie, when did you meet Pastor Ruth, the late Pastor Ruth Ann?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. It's so amazing to be reflecting back so many years. So Pastor Dave had a Bible study. This was prior to Bahamas Faith Ministry being formed.
Pastor Dave had a Bible study.
Dave had a Bible
before
study.
Bahamas Faith Ministry.
Before Bahamas
Okay,
Faith
got to
Ministry.
explain that one. Okay.
He had a Bible study at his home.
Okay.
And many of us who went to the church we went to, and some of the neighbors, some of his friends and the neighbors would come to his home, his parents' home in Oaksfield, and there was a Bible study. And one night, he invited Pastor Miles to be the speaker. This was my first introduction to Pastor Miles, up close and personal.
Gotcha.
Of course, I knew about the Visionaires. Of course, I remembered when they got married, because the wedding, I think, was at our church, the church we used to attend. And so that was my initial meeting. And she came into the house and she was talking about, there were family photos around, and talking about different family members she knew. So that was my initial meeting. Didn't see them anymore for a long time. Sometime later, Pastor Dave came to me and said, we're going to start a ministry. at this time, we were both at the same church. And so I went out and I bought a card. And the card said, "May God bless you in your new venture." Because as far as I was concerned, this was a wonderful thing y'all doing, but I'm going to be at my church. But it's, God bless you.
Exactly.
So I bought him the card, but never was able to give it to him because after that, there was the first meeting set out for Bahamas Faith Ministries, and it was on Prince Charles Drive in a former wash house. Pastor Dave invited me to come along. He said, "We're going to clean up the place before the first meeting." So I went with him. We weren't married at the time. I went with him to clean up the place for the first meeting. Hence, my real introduction to the person of, then it was Miles Monroe, of that person. And everyone was cleaning up. Pastor Sheena was there. Pastor Ruth was there. Pastor Richard was there, Pastor Dave. But Pastor Miles and I ended up being the two persons to clean the restroom. No one wanted to clean the restroom.
And you two were stuck in the restroom.
And so he liked to talk. I like to talk. So we just hit it off, so to speak, and we talked and talked and talked. And hence, that's when I really got introduced to him. And then I got closer with his wife as well, and Pastor Sheena. Then, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just skip some years. So Pastor Miles, still on Mackey Street, wanted to start a women's ministry. And so he appointed Pastor Ruth as the president of Woman of the Word. That's what it was called at the time.
Yeah.
And he assigned me to be the vice president to assist her. And so in working with her, in setting up the meetings, we became closer during that time. And then I recall, some years later, the same year of the transition, she had a birthday party. I remember there was a party for her. And she came to One Rare Publications, which is a company we own, and she said, "I need some thank you cards made up." And so while we were sitting there talking about the thank you cards, we talked about so many other things, and she realized I wanted to build a home for unwed mothers. She said, "Oh my goodness, I want to build a home for mothers and their children as well." And so we'd come up with this plan to build this home. This was in October. We talked about it. Then she said, "Let's just wait until January."
Oh, boy.
Because let's just go through the Christmas season and we'll get over that. And so we never got to do that. But she reminded me of it the day of when they honored us, which was a week before the crash. She reminded me of that.
November 2nd.
November 2nd. And then there was something that happened. Pastor Ruth was really into God. I remember that the year that she transitioned, it was so surreal. But she really was into God. I mean, she was into God, but it was so deep. It was, you could touch it and see it. Something really deep was going on. So I gleaned from that. And we didn't speak about it, but we saw it. We had a situation at church where we were having, not a situation, we were having a meeting, a praise service that Friday night. And she stopped. She had the mic and she stopped. It was June. And to minister to someone, just to hug them and minister to that person. And she looked around, and I wasn't a part of the planning of the meeting or anything, and she gave me the microphone, which let me know that she trusted me, that whatever I would do would make sense and flow in the spirit. And so we had a couple episodes like that. One of them, if we have time, I'll talk about. But to see the God, we didn't just talk about God. We enjoyed times. We celebrated a birthday, a group of us every year. We celebrated a birthday. And even a couple of weeks before, before the transition, we celebrated a birthday. And I'll share this story. So we were in New York. And she had me, I was in charge of the itinerary for the trip. And I was like, oh my goodness. She has me in charge of the itinerary. Oh my goodness. I said, Lord, let me make this right because I don't want her to not be happy. It's a birthday. But I remember the Sunday, I won't go into all the details. A group of us weren't able to go to church because some people were tired. And she came and knocked on the door that Sunday morning because I had arranged for us to go to Times Square Church. Pastor Dave had a friend who arranged for us to be able to go there. And when I opened the door, I said, I can't go to church because everyone in my room is asleep. She said, no, I know we had said we would rest, but I'm going to go to church. She said, I just came to say goodbye. And she waved. And I'm just standing at the door, and she waved. And it was a wave like when you're saying goodbye, like when you're on a trip and you say, see you later. It wasn't, okay, we going to church, we'll be back. And that stayed with me for a very long time. But I learned a lot from her through observation. Sometimes I needed advice from her, how to handle certain situations. And she was firm. She would say, now this is what you do. And even in dealing with females, she gave me advice.
Good.
She gave me advice.
Good.
She was someone I felt comfortable asking certain questions to about how to handle certain things. And so she gave me good advice.
Clearly, Pastor Ruth made an impact on your life.
She did.
And,
She certainly did.
A deep thinker
Yes,
and a
yes.
woman of God. Pastor Dave, certainly Pastor Rich, the late, and Pastor Miles, the late, they were very loquacious men who taught. They were, I believe, your seniors. I don't know, you were close in age, but they were your seniors. What lessons have you learned from both Pastor Rich and Pastor Miles?
Well, they were like my big brothers.
I see.
Pastor Miles was 4 years older than me. Pastor Richard was 3 years older than me. And so I was really the junior person in the group. And so I learned a lot from them because it was a transition for me. I had never had friends like that. I mean, all of my friends were thugs. So here I am among a group of people who are, solidly into God. They were into family life. They didn't understand my world, and I didn't understand their world. But we were joined together through the gospel. And so I learned a lot about family and how to deal with relationships. Pastor Miles was actually my relationship counselor, because coming from my background, there were a lot of things I didn't know about how to treat a woman. And so there were some things that I did innocently, and I had to go to him and I said, well, what happened? What did I do wrong? And then he would tell me, he said, okay, this is how you deal with your wife and so on. So I learned a lot of lessons, practical life lessons. Pastor Richard was like the big brother you could talk to about whatever issues, and we were very close. I likened it to being in a foxhole. So when Pastor Miles began to travel all over the world, Pastor Richard and I, his office was close to mine, and so whenever there were problems or issues, he would call me or I would call him, and I would be in his office or he would be in my office. And so we became very close in that regard. And I learned a lot of lessons from him about dealing with certain situations, dealing with members of the church. I mean, we had a lot of talks about dealing with the people,
HR.
Yeah. So I learned a lot, both spiritually and from a practical perspective from both of them.
Excellent. We're now going to shift gears and talk about that day, that moment, November 9th, 2014. The question has always been to persons around the archipelago of the Bahamas and the world, where were you when you got the news? And what were your initial thoughts? I remember vividly where I was and how I felt and what immediately happened afterwards. But let's hear from you. Pastor Dave.
Before I get to that story, I'm going to tell a quick story. Most people have never heard this before when it came to Pastor Ruth. So Pastor Miles and I were very close. I used to go to his house for lunch. He used to come to my house for lunch. He was working at the Ministry of Education. I was working at the Ministry of Youth. So we were very close. And sometimes he would ask me to pick up Pastor Ruth. And the interesting thing about it was that she was extremely quiet, and I was also very quiet. So we had a lot of quiet rides. But I used to talk
A lot
more.
of silence,
I
eh?
used to talk more than her, so I was able to get her to converse more than she normally would, and more than I normally would. So that's an interesting side story. But when it comes to that day, I'll start from Friday. So on Friday, Pastor Richard and we were leaving his house, going somewhere, and I think he was dropping me home, I believe. And Pastor Miles called, and he said, Pastor Richard, are you going with me on Sunday? And then Pastor Richard was a little bit reluctant at first, and then he looked at me, he said, well, it's only a 20-minute flight. Okay, I'll go. And then so Pastor Miles said, let me talk to Dave. And he said to me, Dave, you gonna go with us also? And I said, well, I used to call, my nickname for him was Chief, But Pastor Richard and we used to call him Chief. So I said, Chief, I already got a ticket for my daughter and I, so we're gonna join you on Monday morning. We'll miss the opening. So he said, okay, can you give me Pastor Lavard's number? And so I gave him Pastor Lavard's number. Mm-hmm. So really, Pastor Lavard actually took my place. If I had said yes, I would have been on the flight. And, obviously I didn't say yes. So that Sunday, I dropped Pastor Richard to the airport, and then I was on my way home. I was on the way back. And then I got home, I sat down. My routine on Sundays was to watch football games. So I ate, watched football games, and then, when the itis sets in, you fall asleep. So I was asleep on my couch or on my breakfast nook, and every phone in the house started ringing simultaneously. And then people started asking me, is it true? Did Pastor Miles' plane
What time
crash?
was it then?
This was in the afternoon, I believe maybe around 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock,
something
yeah.
like that.
That's when I started to get. Mm-hmm.
So I'm there getting these calls, and then Pastor Angie's phone is ringing, and then all the house phones are ringing, and everybody is calling about the same thing. So people asked me, and I didn't know, and so I called Freeport. I called Pastor Larry at first, and Pastor Larry said, hold on, I have to get back to you. But there were so many people calling me, and I was so concerned, I said, I can't wait on Pastor Larry, so I called Pastor Pat. And I called Pastor Pat, and Pastor Pat said, he said, Dave, N17 is down and there are no survivors. And that's when I realized this is real,
Wow.
And I sat there, and instinctively, I said, you know what? We have to do something.
And N17 is the license number on the plane.
It was the number of the plane.
Number of the plane.
So I said, I knew instinctively that I had to do something. Now, mind you, I was not the most senior person on the board. Pastor Henry was actually the most senior person on the board. But something just on the inside of me said, you have to do something. So I called all the board members and I said, meet me at the church. When we came here to meet at the church, I met Pastor Henry outside the boardroom. And before I went into the boardroom, Pastor Henry looked at me and he said, it's on you. And so then I began to realize, hey, this is really on me. It's my responsibility. I have to take charge. Now, that was a bit of a shock. It was a bit of a conundrum, because as everybody knew, I was not interested in being a senior pastor. I was not interested. I was actually on my way to doing something else in ministry. I was launching
Transitioning, yeah.
a youth and family. I had launched a youth and family center. I was transitioning to my own ministry. And so here I am in the boardroom, and we discussing the way forward. But it became very apparent to me, as it was to Pastor Henry, that, as the senior person in the ministry, I had to shift, and that was a challenge because I had to process a lot of things. I had to accept the assignment. And there was a reluctance on my part, but I also realized that there wasn't an alternative. You know, I always say that when the baby was born, there were 4 people in the room, 2 were on the plane.
Exactly.
There were only 2 left. And of the 2 that were left, the other one said to me, "It's you." So I had to process it and say, okay, you know, this is your assignment. I had to figure it out. One thing that I began to realize as we went through the process was that when you're in the kingdom, it's like the foreign service. You sign up as a diplomat, but you never determine your assignment. You wait for the king to say where you're going next. And so this is how I had to look at it. I had to look at it as, okay, I'm in the service of the kingdom. A situation happened that requires me to change my plans. And my new assignment is a post in a country that I had never heard of.
Well said.
But I had to accept it,
Well said.
you know. And so not to say that it was easy, because there were times, especially in the initial phases, where I wanted to give up. You know, I remember calling my brother-in-law in Charlotte, North Carolina, Robin Gould, and I said to Robin, I don't think I could do this. And because he had a lot of experience in ministry, he said, "Dave, here's what you need to do." He said, this is your responsibility. This is your assignment. You can do it. It's different from what you've done before, but you have the gifts, you have the talents, you have the ability, you have the experience. You can do it. And he walked me step by step, because he had years and years of experience as a senior pastor. And he told me what to do. And one of the things that he told me that was very important is, he said, you don't have to do everything. He said, you have people around you who can help you. And that was the key for me, accepting the assignment and understanding that I could do it.
You're not alone.
And I could do it comfortably.
Very good. And Pastor Angie, you too, talk a little bit about where you were and how it got from Pastor Dave doing what he did and how you supported him through that process, because obviously you were in sync. Tell me a little bit about your experience.
Well, that day I was at home as well, and I was actually in the vehicle with Pastor Dave when we picked up Pastor Richard from his house.
I see.
I was in the front, and then I came out of the front, and I went in the back, and there was a young lady with us who we normally picked up for church. And we would take her home. Her mother would get her after church, because her mom worked at the airport. And so when we got to the airport, so we got to Pastor Richard's house first. He came out. He leaned out the window. He said, "Angie, tell Dave I'm coming right now." So I said, "You heard Pastor Richard? He's coming right now." And he came out, and he had changed his shirt and tie, because he was a really sharp dresser. And he had on a shirt and a bow tie at church that day. And he changed and put on changed his shirt, and he brought his jacket. So I said, "Give me a jacket, let me hang it up, instead of putting it on your lap." He said, "That's okay." He said, "No, I have a hanger right here." So I hung up his jacket. We went to the airport, dropped him off, and went home. So I was home with Pastor Dave. I was upstairs. He was downstairs. And I kept getting calls. And calls from members here, calls from my friends in Freeport, calls from my family members. My parents got 47 phone calls, and that's when they took their phone off the hook, because some of our family members heard it and assumed that when they heard the youth pastor was on the plane, they assumed it was. So my parents picked up what was going on. So it was trauma. So I said, "You know what? He's going to church. I'm going to get." And I did let out a scream. I did. And I realized who all was on the plane. And after I let out the scream, I immediately felt like, okay, you let the scream out, but you now have to be able to support others. So I came to the church and met. My daughter came home, but she had to be driven home. She couldn't even drive her car home, but she was driven home. And then people came with her and gave me some instructions. I came to church. When we parked out front, I saw the twin sister of Verdell. That was very difficult for me. And she said to me, she said, Pastor Angie, is it true? Her husband was on the side of her. And all I did was I just held her, and I kept holding her, and I kept holding her. Because that was my way of saying, I'm here for you, and it is true. And it was a real difficult moment. And so, but I realized that as bad as I felt, that I had to give people hope. And it only came, the strength only came from God.
Yes, yes.
I remember Pastor Carl Aubrey, he said, you were helping people, but the pain was on your face. It was quite obvious. And so I guess that's what is called pressing through the pain. But it was a moment in time that is etched in my mind.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. In my own personal experience, I instinctively, Pastor Dave, came to church and went to the boardroom. And I didn't get a phone call, but somehow I ended up in the boardroom. Maybe it was because of my position at the time in government, I don't know. And I watched that transition and that conversation between Pastor Henry saying to us, he know he has the responsibility, but he yielded it to Pastor Dave. That was one of the most profound experiences of my life, and I'll never forget it. When I saw the dignity of Pastor Henry in the face of what he suffered and the courage of Pastor Dave. Pastor Dave, we could have seen when you swallowed how the lump in your throat, how much you did not want it, and perhaps the fear you had, but the courage to receive the baton and the mantle was quite profound for me, and that was quite an unforgettable experience. So now you've been here, and what was the transition like in leading the church from that point on and taking it, sustaining it, and eventually flourishing it? Talk a little bit about that experience.
You know, everybody looks at the transition and they say, wow, it was such a smooth transition. But people don't know what happened behind the scenes.
Exactly.
And I think God guided me through the process. There were many challenges. You know, there was misinformation. I know the press in the Bahamas, they started to say different things. Internationally, persons who didn't know about BFM, they started to say that I executed an illegal takeover. I took the church from the children. Or they said, I took it from Pastor Kirsch, who was announced as the fellowship pastor of the church by Dr. Monroe. But people didn't understand the structure of BFM and that the fellowship pastor is different from the senior pastor.
Correct.
So there were assumptions made and things that people said. There were also people who were subversive. There were people who wanted to go on the radio and say things. There were people who wanted to come into the church and prophesy. People actually approached me and said, you know, the next Sunday morning, the Lord gave me something to say. And so I had to do what God told Joshua. He said, be very strong and courageous. You know, you are leading these people who caused Moses to cuss and to strike the rock.
People, absolutely.
So you're going to need to be strong and courageous. And so I realized that I had to be strong. And you had to exert authority, and you had to make sure that people knew that the vision was going forward and that the vision was in the hands of a team. The good thing about Bahamas Faith Ministries is that we weren't structured like a normal church. In a normal church, the congregation will vote. And the thing about our structure is that the decision-making body was the Board of Governors. And the Board of Governors was on one accord, so we didn't have a problem, we didn't have issues. The other thing is that we were decisive. You know, we didn't say, well, let's wait and see what happens, because the longer you wait, the less stability there is, and the more questions arise. We knew it needed to be done as a team, and we decided this is what has to be done. I accepted the responsibility, and then everybody was in support, and we just moved forward. So it was a challenging time. It was a trying time. There were a lot of lessons along the way. You know, there was no template, and it was in the middle of a tragedy. You know, some persons called me from the U.S. and they said, we have never heard of anything like this. You lose your senior pastor, you lose the assistant pastor, you lose the youth pastor, all in one swoop. It was almost like, you know, like everything was taken away.
Yes.
And all the responsibility then came upon me. But one thing I can say, thankfully, is that we had a team of very smart, intelligent, and spiritual people on our Board of Governors, and they made a difference. You know, I didn't do anything on my own. We decided together, we came to agreement. I was supported in a very tangible way from the board members. There was a lot of encouragement. We navigated it together. And I remember that, you know, early in the game, I decided that I needed additional help because we lost board members on the flight. And that's when you came in and Pastor Ethan Moss came in. And, you know, that really strengthened the structure of the board. It gave us a great diversity of skill and talent and wisdom. And we were able to use, you know, the new structure, the new board members. And so even though it was challenging, it was probably smoother than most transitions because we had a team that was on one accord. We were not guessing. There weren't fights in the background and people questioning my authority and the choices we made or anything like that. So that really helped us to move forward.
Excellent. And certainly agree with you wholeheartedly because I can certainly attest to the fact that it was extremely smooth, and which was a very much a surprise compared to what persons expected. Sanji, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, well, my role was support. I was the support person. So I just went into support mode at home. So the conversations weren't foolish we joke a lot. But during that period, it was no time for
It was
joking.
serious business, eh?
It was serious business.
Yeah.
I stayed prayed up. I stayed in position to assist however I could assist. I saw myself as a support person. And so I supported the church. But before I supported the church, I supported him. I think I supported the church 25%, but 75%, I just supported him because I said I just wanted God's will to be done. So I supported however I could support. I supported with prayer, a peaceful home. I didn't allow too many people to come to my house during that time. No, we can't. No, you can't come right now. I don't want too many jokes.
Protect your environment.
Yeah, I just want us to be able to hear from God, and I didn't want any confusion to come into my home through me in terms of, oh, you all having girls' night. No, this is sackcloth and ashes time. This isn't time for celebration. So I just focused on being a support, spiritually and otherwise. And I made sure he ate properly.
That's important.
Yeah, the natural. See,
the
people
strength.
forget that.
Yes, yeah. Pastor Dave, you've now been the senior pastor for 10 years, and you've had to make some difficult decisions. Some of them may have been unpopular. Tell us about some of those decisions you've made and the impact it has on the ministry to a place now where we're not surviving anymore. We are flourishing.
Well, what's interesting is that, I keep going back to what God told Joshua, and I realize that one of the most important elements in leadership and transition is courage. When you postpone critical decisions, they don't get easier.
Absolutely.
So it's better to make the difficult decision, to deal with the blowback, and to move on, because if you postpone it, it's going to get worse. So as I looked around the ministry, I realized that I was now responsible. And that was a challenge in itself, because you're following a legend. You're following a global icon. Most people are already sorry that you were here. I mean, it's not about you. It's about missing the global icon.
Understood, yes.
And you show up in his place. So that took a lot of courage.
Yes.
And I had to realize that I could not pretend to be him. I could not wear his clothes. Somebody came to me and they said, well, you got big shoes to fill. I say, no. I say, my shoes are size 12. His own may be size 8 or 9 or whatever it is. I can't wear his shoes. I can walk in his footsteps, but I can't wear his shoes. And I realized from the beginning that I had to wear my own clothes. And I could not replace him. So this was not about replacing. This was about succeeding. Succession means to follow the person who was there before you. And so I could succeed. And I realized that in order to have a good succession, I needed courage. And I needed to look at the situation on the ground and make the difficult decisions. And I had no consternation about making difficult decisions. My personality, the way I am, and people know me from, I was a little boy. I would make the difficult decision. I wasn't afraid of making decisions. And so, I looked at, what was around me. I realized that we needed younger leadership. We needed a change because we had a change of personality. We had a change of methodology. Dr. Monroe and I were different. And so the organization, the vision would look the same, but how it's carried out would look different. And I had to inform, I had to educate people, and sometimes I had to demonstrate so people understood that it's going to be different. And we have to make some difficult decisions. And some of the difficult decisions was about changing persons, introducing new leaders, introducing new board members, changing the methodology. Dr. Monroe was a very inspirational leader. He was a visionary, and he talked long, and he held long meetings and so on. I was a different type of personality. I'm a very pragmatic person. I don't waste a lot of time. I just get straight to the point. So I restructured a lot of things, and to a certain extent, people felt offended because I was changing what Dr. Monroe had instituted. But, I had to get people to understand. And thankfully, once people saw what I was doing and why I was doing it, they came around. And people again began to appreciate my style and, my method of doing things. And so that helped the transition to be smoother. But I think the main thing was courage. Courage and vision. You have to focus in on the vision. You can't people came to me and they said, what's the new vision for the church?
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, people were like, okay, Pastor Miles is gone now. What's your vision? And I had to explain to people that we started this together. This was our vision. He was the primary visionary, but the others in the group, we all contributed to the vision. This was our vision. And so I was not coming up with me as a new individual as starting something new. I was, as the book of Habakkuk said, it says, write the vision down and make it plain so that he may run who reads it. The vision is for an appointed time, and it will not tarry. It will succeed. So I took that scripture, and I realized that the vision was written down, and I was the one who had to run with it. And so it was like I'm running another leg of the race. You know, Dr. Monroe handed it off to me at the third leg, and now I have to bring it home. You know, it was something that wasn't anticipated, but I had to go by the blueprint. And the good thing about it was I was already running. I already knew the vision. So it wasn't difficult to refine the vision and to take it not in a different direction, but to take it there in a different way.
I think one of the challenges, and this is going to take us to the segment that deals with transition to senior pastor. Being a youth pastor for many years, people tend to put you in a box. And I think one of the challenges we faced, and I'm sure you felt it, is how can a youth pastor now transition to senior pastor, to adults, and to everyone? What was that transition like? And did your message change, and how you implemented this new concept or this new idea of now speaking to not to young people, but to all persons?
It was a major change. It was a major adjustment because I never desired to be a senior pastor. In fact, I ran away from it. On several occasions, including 2013, Dr. Monroe came to me and asked me, and I kept saying no, not because I wanted to be disobedient, but because I did not feel that this was my best fit. I was a youth and family specialist. You know, my ministry began on the streets. I had a level of comfort in dealing with young people, and I felt like it was my assignment. I didn't feel like being a senior pastor was my assignment. So it required a lot of adjustment. I was used to being very casual. My speech was kind of, you know, modern, up-to-date youth speech. I dealt with a lot of topics that related to young people. And so taking over the church and becoming the senior pastor, it meant a shift. I never wore a suit and tie. You know, and initially I wore suits and ties. But after a while I began to realize that, okay, suit and ties that was the staple of who was before me, Pastor Richard, Pastor Miles, and so on. That's not necessarily the wardrobe that I was comfortable with. And so I changed. And when I changed, some persons in the congregation got upset. They were like, Pastor Dave, do you realize you were wearing jeans on a Sunday morning? I wore a jacket, but I wore jeans. But I realized that it required some adjustment, and you know, I had to create a balance. So what ended up happening was I realized that, okay, some of the older people were offended, the younger people were excited. And so I had to create this balance between the younger people and the old people. Some of my initial sermons incorporated a lot of elements that were common in the youth ministry. Sometimes I talked about my history, you know, when I'm talking to young people, and I'm talking about, you know, riding down the road with the police chasing me and so on and so forth. And coming into the adult church, you know, some of these things, some adults cringed at. And so I began to realize that, you know, there's a balance. I had to incorporate what was previously my staple terminology and sermon structure. I had to mesh that with some elements of what Dr. Monroe would have done, but in my own unique way. And I found my way as we went along, you know, and people appreciated it. You know, I got a lot of compliments. You know, what was interesting to me is that I've spoken church on a regular, I mean, not on a regular basis, but periodically over time. And so the congregation was familiar with me. I was not a stranger, but they were not familiar with me in that role. And so, initially people didn't know how I was going to present myself. They didn't know how I was going to do. But what was interesting is that from the first week, older members came up to me and they said, "Thank you so much. We are in good hands."
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a level of assurance. When older people said to me,
Comfort,
they
yeah.
said, people said, "I see why you were here." So that was comforting, and that helped me to navigate the process.
So that's interesting, because that actually was my next question. That speaks to some of your proudest moments over the last 10 years. And what would you like your legacy over the last 10 years to look like?
In terms of the proudest moments, I am so proud to see how the church has matured and developed, and how new leadership has emerged, and how the vision has continued even though the players have changed. It's a testament to the leadership of Dr. Monroe. It's a testament to the power of vision, and that vision overrides personalities. And so I'm really proud of the fact that the church didn't fall apart, people didn't get discouraged, and people began to take their place. I looked at persons like yourself. I looked at Ethan. I look at Merritt. I look at some of the pastors who came up in the children's church, pastor, so many other areas where people stepped forward and took their place, and we didn't miss a beat. It was different faces, but the vision continued, and the vision continued without any fallout, without any blowback, without any, there were some people who left, but the interesting thing about it is people left and more people came. I was pleasantly surprised that in the first year after Dr. Monroe passed, the ministry actually grew. That was amazing, and it was amazing to know that people had confidence in my leadership, because one of the things that a number of local pastors told me, and even international persons told me, they said, "Dave, don't pay attention to who is here in November and December after the crash." They said, "In the new year, a lot of people are going to believe because Dr. Monroe is no longer here." And so I didn't necessarily believe them, but it created a seed of doubt in my mind. I wondered what would happen. And so I was pleasantly surprised that not only did people continue coming, people who weren't coming before started coming, and new people began to come into the ministry. And I think I'm proud of the fact that Dr. Pinder and Dr. Monroe, they could look down from heaven and they could say, both of them used to call me Davy B at times. They said, "Man, Davy B, you took it
You're
home."
holding it together. Good. It's good.
And I think that's the most important thing for me in terms of a legacy, that I ran my leg of the race.
Excellent. Well said, Pastor. Thank you so much. Well, we are at Legacy Month. We're here. 10 years has gone, and November is just around the corner. We're here, actually. What is your expectations for Legacy Month? What would you like the takeaways to be, both you and Pastor Angie, when we conclude Legacy Month?
Oh, well, you going to go
Angie,
first?
Go ahead. You go first.
It's an interesting word, Dr. Major. I know it's going to sound strange, but that being obedient to the vision produces good results.
Yes, it does. Yes.
And so I'm thankful that I was obedient. I was an obedient wife. What do I mean? Got some words of prophecy from a past Apostle Falman Ferguson sometime in the past. He said, the Lord is going to is calling your husband to be a pastor. I said, so I reject that prophecy because he's not calling his wife to be a pastor's wife. And so I learned obedience. I thought I knew what obedience looked like. I learned obedience.
I know now, yes.
I learned a new level of love for people. I didn't know. I knew I could love young people. I knew I could love the women I ministered to privately. But he gave me a grace and a love for people that only could come from him. And I realized he gives you grace for an assignment. Because I love every member of this church, every follower, every visitor. But it doesn't come from me, it comes from God. Because sometimes people say, Sister so-and-so, Brother so-and-so is getting on my nerves. I could deal with Brother so-and-so. I could deal with Sister so-and-so, even if I know something that they did that was not proper towards me. And I know it's his grace and his anointing for the season. Maybe when the season is over, of me being Pastor Dave's wife and of him being the pastor, maybe that'll lift. But he has graced me. And so I've walked in a grace with God. I never knew that I could love every single person, no matter what. So you don't have to be on my side for me to love you as a member. I just love you.
Yes.
Because that's what parents do,
Yes.
love their children. And so obedience and a new level of love and the grace of God.
He called you and he provided for you, gave you the grace. That's wonderful. Pastor Dave?
Can you repeat the question?
The question spoke to being now the senior pastor for the last 10 years. We are now in Legacy Month. And as you reflect on your last 10 years, what would you like the takeaways to be at the end of Legacy Month?
I think the most important takeaway for me was that I was faithful to my assignment.
Yes.
You know, it's not really about me, because if it was about me, I would have been someplace else. It wasn't about my comfort level. It was about me being faithful to the assignment. So as we look into Legacy Month, I think of the faithfulness of God, that God brought us through a most challenging period, an unfathomable circumstance. And through being faithful to God, we were able to achieve great things. We were able to see the ministry move forward, and we continue to see lives change. You know, when we talk about paradigm shift in terms of the country of the Bahamas Faith Ministries has left an indelible mark on the Bahamas. Every aspect, not just church, the nation has been significantly impacted by Bahamas Faith Ministries. Everywhere I go in this country, whether it's business people, whether it's athletes, church leaders, everyone has a story that I run into who I speak with. They say to me, Dr. Miles Monroe, Bahamas Faith Ministries, had an impact on my life. And to see that same legacy continue globally, people are still being impacted. You know, I see people flying into the Bahamas on a regular basis just to come to this church.
Yes, yes.
They would sit down and talk with me, and they would say, Dr. Monroe had an influence on me. And then they would say, you also had an influence on me. The one story that just reminds me of the impact, and sometimes you don't realize it, was Pastor Angie and I, we were in Mandela Square in South Africa, I think it was 2018, and we were walking through the mall, and a young man is walking behind us. And it made me a little comfortable, like, why is this guy following us? And then he came and tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around and he said, are you Dave Burrows? And I started to think to myself, I'm in South Africa. How does this young man know me? And he says to me, he says, I watch you on YouTube. He said, I heard your testimony. He said, I was just like you. I was from the streets. He said, today I own a publishing company. And it became possible after I heard your story.
It's a great testimony.
And that caused me to realize that the impact continues. Dr. Monroe continues to impact the world through video. Bahamas Faith Ministries continues to impact the world through video, YouTube. There are persons who tune in every week who even have become members of Bahamas Faith Ministries in India, Africa, Australia, all over the world, and they are bought into the vision. And so, during Legacy Month, it reminds me that the vision continues and that this vision was orchestrated by God, and it's for an appointed time, and it has had its impact. And the impact will continue because my time will be gone. I don't know when, but there'll be a time when I'll be gone. But this vision is going to continue because we have transferred the vision. Dr. Monroe was the visionary who imparted the vision to us. Collectively, we contributed to, we expanded upon, we did things to cause the vision to grow and to continue. Me succeeding him, I was able to run a leg of the race with a vision that was for an appointed time. My job now, and what I have been focusing in on, is transferring the vision, transferring the knowledge, the leadership capacity, the skills to another generation of leaders. And if you've been to one of our services, especially our children and youth services, you can see that the vision will continue.
No question about that. No question about that. Although that would be a great place to end, I do have a couple more questions for you. What would be your message to the members of this church and the wider community with respect to legacy?
My message to the church and the wider community is that this vision was born of God. It is both a local and a global vision. And everyone who has been drawn to it has an assignment.
Yeah.
It's not a spectator sport. Those of us who have been impacted by the vision, we have a responsibility. So I say to our members, I say to our followers, I say to persons who have been impacted, the legacy of BFM is you. And you have to determine within your heart, how do you serve the vision and how do you carry the vision forward? Just like at the night of the crash, I realized the responsibility was on me. When I exit the stage, the responsibility is going to be on those who've been impacted by the vision. When you've been given much, much is required.
Absolutely.
And so those of you who have benefited from the vision, your life has been changed, you have an obligation to continue this vision and to give back and to be faithful to your assignment.
Excellent. As we close, Pastor Dave and Pastor Angie, this has been a most enjoyable experience for me personally, and I'm sure for the wider listening and video audience. Your leadership, what would you like when you're off the stage and move on to another frontier of your life? What would you like those to remember about Pastor Dave Burrows and Pastor Angela Burrows?
You want to go first?
I want them to remember that I inspired them to be better. Inspired them to be better spiritually. Inspired them to go deeper with God, to abandon the surface level relationships and wherever people were to go deeper. Inspire them to bring people into the kingdom of God, because it's not just good enough for you to be saved, but to inspire people to go and bring people into the kingdom, to inspire people to do what we've been advised, encouraged to do, to find the purpose that God has for you. Dr. Monroe said it over and repeatedly. Pastor Richard talked about the fact that he had several books. In fact, he released 3 books on the day of the crash, 3 books. So to mobilize, one of his books prior to those 3 books was Mobilizing Human Resources. Become mobilized in the church, become mobilized in the community, make a difference. This vision is for this church, but it's to empower each person to go out. And so my desire in terms of when I look back, the spiritual and the natural. If you're not educated, go to school. You may not want to go to a university. Go to a trade school. Our founder desired for us to become agents of change. And so you become an agent of change. Don't remain a follower. Don't remain a leader, but become that agent of change. And that would make a difference in the country, Dr. Major, I believe, and indeed the world. So if we just took the vision and we would run with the vision, we would see a change in our church, in our community, in our country, in the world.
Absolutely. Well said. Pastor Dave, you have the last word.
I think the important thing that important takeaway would be, we fulfilled the vision. Our vision, and one of our statements that everybody who's associated with BFM knows, we transform followers into leaders and leaders into agents of change. And I think our legacy as the leadership team is that's what we did. The other part of the vision statement of Bahamas Faith Ministries is that there's only one message, and that message is the gospel of the kingdom. So we were also faithful to execute and deliver the message of the kingdom to the point where others can take it and deliver it also. And I think that would be 2 of the most important elements of our legacy, because we fulfilled the vision that was written down and stated, and we ran our leg of the race successfully.
Thank you very much, Pastor Dave and Pastor Angie, for your presence here this evening. And we will be right back after these messages.
Introducing the Legacy T-shirt, a limited edition design celebrating the legacy of greatness at Bahamas Faith Ministries. Don't miss your chance to own this exclusive piece of history. For just $30, you can pre-order yours today. Visit www.bfmilegacy.com or WhatsApp us at 242-447-1805 to secure your shirt. And get ready for Homecoming Sunday on November 24th. Join us as we celebrate in style for Legacy T-shirt Day. Wear your legacy proudly and be a part of this special moment. Pre-order now while supplies last.
Pastor Dave and Pastor Angie, I just wanted to thank you for your commitment to this ministry, commitment to leadership and the vision that you've established over the many years. And again, thank you for joining us on Legacy Insights this evening. We look forward to an amazing Legacy Month and to seeing what God has in store for Bahamas Faith Ministries International in the years ahead. We invite our listeners and viewing audiences to stay tuned for more Legacy Insights and events throughout the month of November. Our signature events are November 10th at 10 a.m. at the Miles E. Monroe Diplomat Center, where we will recognize and honor our surviving founders, followed immediately by our Gala Legacy Luncheon at 3 p.m. at the Bahama Convention Center. Please visit us at bfmilegacy.com for further details. Thank you for joining us for this special episode of Legacy Insights. Good evening.
That was such an inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. A special thank you to Dr. Dave and Angela Burrows for their wisdom and leadership, and to Dr. Kendall Major for leading this discussion on the significance of our legacy here at BFMI. If you're feeling inspired and want to be a part of building this legacy, we encourage you to sign up as a volunteer. Visit bfmilegacy.com to find out how you can get involved and serve. Thanks again for joining us on Legacy Insights. I'm Tanya Major, and we'll see you next time. God bless.